There is a room in Beijing that has witnessed some of the most consequential handshakes in modern history. The Great Hall of the People, right on the edge of Tiananmen Square, is where China conducts the business of reshaping the world. And in January of 2026, that room was busier than it has been in years. One after another, Western leaders walked through its doors to sit across from President Xi Jinping. Canada, Finland, Ireland, South Korea, the United Kingdom, France, Uruguay. The parade of visitors was so relentless that Forbes magazine described it as Beijing rolling out the red carpet almost daily. And if you are watching this and thinking, wait, are not these supposed to be America's allies? Well, that is exactly the question that makes this story so important. Before we get into it, do me a solid. Smash that like button and subscribe to the channel because stories like this one are going to define the world we live in for the next decade, and you want to be ahead of the curve. All right, let me paint the picture of how we got here. Because this did not happen overnight. This is the result of a chain reaction that started with one word: tariffs. When Donald Trump launched his tariff offensive in early 2025, he did not just go after China. He went after everybody, using emergency powers that no other president had ever used to impose trade barriers. He raised the average effective tariff rate in the United States from roughly 2.5% to an estimated 27%. That is the highest level in over a century. We are talking 1930s territory here. And the thing that nobody seemed to anticipate, or maybe they did but did not care, is that when you punish your friends the same way you punish your rivals, your friends start looking for new friends. Let me start with Canada because the Canadian story really sets the tone for everything else. For years, Ottawa and Beijing were barely on speaking terms. Diplomatic relations had been frozen for nearly a decade. But in early January of 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney made a decision that sent shockwaves through Washington. He flew to Beijing, not for a symbolic gesture, not for a photo op. He went there to sign deals. And he did. Canada agreed to reduce tariffs on a limited number of Chinese-made electric vehicles from 100% all the way down to 6.1%. In return, China cut its duties on Canadian canola seeds and other agricultural products. After the trip, Carney said something that would have been political suicide just a couple of years earlier. He described Canada's relationship with China as more predictable than its relationship with the United States. Think about the weight of those words. A Canadian Prime Minister, the leader of America's closest neighbor and oldest ally, publicly saying that a communist superpower is a more stable partner than Washington. That is not a diplomatic talking point. That is a distress signal. Trump's reaction was predictable. He threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if Carney pushed forward with the China deal. He warned that China would eat Canada alive, devour it. But Carney, who had run Goldman Sachs operations and led the central banks of both Canada and the UK before entering politics, was not bluffing. He pushed ahead. Standing in Quebec City after the trip, he said, "In a time of rising walls and thickening borders, we demonstrate how a country can be both open and secure, welcoming and strong, principled and powerful." The man clearly had no intention of backing down. Now, if Canada was the opening act, the United Kingdom was the headliner. On January 28th, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer boarded a plane for Beijing, the first British leader to visit China in 8 years. To understand why that matters, you need to know what happened in those 8 years. The crackdown on Hong Kong's democracy movement. The sweeping national security legislation that Beijing imposed on the former British colony. The detention of Jimmy Lai, a British citizen and media mogul, on national security charges. Accusations of Chinese espionage on British soil. One scandal after another had pushed London and Beijing so far apart that many people, assumed the relationship was permanently broken. But Starmer saw things differently. Someone close to him told the Observer newspaper that Starmer believed it was a dereliction of duty by previous prime ministers not to go to China. And when he went big. Nearly 60 British companies and cultural organizations sent representatives on the trip. We are talking the chairman of HSBC, the CEO of AstraZeneca, executives from Airbus, British Airways, GSK, and many more. This was not diplomacy. This was an economic invasion force, dressed in suits. And here is where it gets interesting. Starmer sat down with Xi Jinping for a meeting that was supposed to last 40 minutes. It went on for 80. By the time the visit was over, the two sides had signed 12 intergovernmental cooperation documents covering trade, agriculture, food, culture, and market regulation. The UK secured £2.2 billion in export deals and roughly £2.3 billion in expanded market access over the next 5 years. China cut tariffs on British whiskey from 10% to 5%, a move expected to add about £250 million to the UK economy. Chinese energy company HITHIUM pledged £200 million in UK investments. AstraZeneca announced plans to pour $15 billion into China through 2030. Pop Mart committed to opening London as a regional headquarters. Chery Commercial Vehicles picked Liverpool for its European base. And in a move that carried enormous symbolic weight, China granted British citizens visa-free entry for up to 30 days. After the meeting, Starmer took a walk through the Forbidden City. Xi Jinping had personally arranged the visit, just as he had for Carney and Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo before him. Walking through the 600-year-old palace, Starmer told reporters that engaging with China is in the national interest. That is why we have got such a big business delegation, he said. Orpo, who had visited the same week with his own delegation of top Finnish executives, described the Forbidden City as stunning and said plainly, "You do not understand China unless you go to China." So let me ask you something. Why are all these leaders saying the same thing at the same time? And the answer brings us back to what is happening in Washington. See, Trump's tariff regime is not just some abstract trade policy. It is hitting real people in real ways. The Tax Foundation estimates that the tariff burden amounts to about $1,000 per American household in 2025, rising to $1,300 in 2026. Goldman Sachs estimates that 55% of tariff costs are now being passed directly to consumers. Corporate bankruptcies have hit their highest level since 2010. Job growth has slowed. The promised manufacturing boom has not arrived. And the uncertainty, the constant on-again, off-again nature of Trump's trade policy is making it nearly impossible for businesses to plan ahead. For America's allies, the calculus is simple. If the world's largest economy is going to be unpredictable, you need to diversify. And the world's second largest economy just happens to be rolling out the red carpet. But this is not just about bilateral deals with China. The entire architecture of global trade is being rewritten. Let me give you two massive examples. On January 17, 2026, the European Union and the Mercosur bloc of South American nations, that is Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, signed a trade agreement that had been in negotiations for over 25 years. When implemented, it would create one of the world's largest free trade areas, covering about 700 million consumers across 31 countries. The projected savings for EU firms? Over €4 billion per year in customs duties alone. Then just 10 days later, the EU pulled off something even bigger. On January 27, Brussels and New Delhi concluded what European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called the mother of all deals, a comprehensive free trade agreement between the EU and India. This creates a free trade zone of 2 billion people, representing roughly 25% of global GDP. Under the deal, India agreed to eliminate or reduce tariffs on 96.6% of EU exports. Car tariffs, previously as high as 110%, will gradually fall to 10% with a quota of 250,000 EU vehicles per year. In return, the EU will cut tariffs on 99.5% of Indian goods. Now, both of these deals had been in various stages of negotiation for years, some for decades. The EU-India talks had been stalled on and off for nearly 20 years. But what finally created the political will to close them? Analysts at the Atlantic Council were blunt about it. They said Trump's tariffs and trade threats clearly provided the immediate impetus. Both sides needed to diversify their trade relationships in response to uncertainty from the United States. Now here is the part of the story that most people miss, and honestly, this is my favorite part. How does China actually see all of this? Because from the outside, it looks like Xi Jinping just won the lottery. Allies of America are lining up at his door. Trade deals are being signed. New partnerships are forming. You would think Beijing is throwing a party, right? Well, not exactly. Chinese strategic thinkers are actually quite skeptical about the durability of this Western warm-up. A prominent Chinese scholar on American politics captured the mood perfectly using a traditional idiom. He compared the U.S.-Europe relationship to a married couple, saying they may quarrel at the headboard, but they reconcile at the foot of the bed. In other words, fight all you want, but at the end of the day, you are sleeping in the same bed. The prevailing view in Chinese strategic circles is that the West remains an exclusive, if temporarily dysfunctional, club. Britain's outreach, Canada's trade deals, Finland's business delegations from Beijing's vantage point, these are just the latest policy oscillations driven by whoever is in the White House. Today, Trump is pushing allies away, so they come to China. Tomorrow, a different president, or even the same president with a different mood, and they pivot right back. And there is historical precedent for this cynicism. Back in 2017, Trump had two lavish summits with Xi Jinping. One at Mar-a-Lago, one in Beijing's very own Forbidden City. Both were celebrated as diplomatic breakthroughs. And what came next? The trade war of 2018 and 2019. So the Chinese have learned, perhaps the hard way, to be cautious about Western leaders bearing gifts. But even the skeptics in Beijing would acknowledge that something structural has shifted. This is not just about Trump's personality or one election cycle. The tariff regime has caused real, lasting damage to the credibility of the United States as a trade partner. The Canadian economy is weakening from what the Bank of Canada calls a structural transition caused by U.S. tariffs. Mexico's GDP contracted, sparking recession fears. European industries that depend on transatlantic trade are suffering. And as Yale professor Jeffrey Sonnenfeld argued in a widely read analysis, Trump has started a trade war that America cannot win alone. The irony, Sonnenfeld pointed out, is devastating. The legitimate complaints about China, the subsidies, the intellectual property issues, the forced technology transfers, those can only be addressed through collective action by Democratic allies. But Trump has undermined that very coalition through his indiscriminate tariffs. As Sonnenfeld put it, when you overuse a stick, it tends to break, even if it is an American stick. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping is executing what can only be described as a diplomatic masterclass. He opened 2026 with back-to-back conversations with the leaders of the world's other two great powers, holding a video call with Putin and a phone call with Trump on the same day, the Chinese calendar's first day of spring. The South China Morning Post called it an extraordinary example of China's diplomacy. He designated 2026 through 2027 as China-Russia years of education. He continued the 36-year tradition of Chinese foreign ministers beginning each year with a visit to Africa. He designated 2026 as the China-Africa Year of people-to-people exchanges. And with every visiting leader, he briefed them on China's 15th five-year plan for 2026 through 2030, positioning China as a reliable long-term partner in an unstable world. He even quoted classical Chinese philosophy to Trump during their phone call, telling him it is always right to do a good thing, however small, and always wrong to do a bad thing, however small. When he met the new ambassadors to China, he invoked the parable of the blind men and the elephant, a not-so-subtle suggestion that the West is only seeing pieces of China, not the whole picture. Every gesture calibrated. Every word chosen with care. Now, let me bring this back to the big picture because I do not want to oversimplify this. Xi Jinping gaining leverage does not mean China has replaced the United States. Not even close. America's GDP sits at roughly $28.75 trillion compared to China's $18.74 trillion. American military superiority is unmatched. And as that Chinese scholar acknowledged, the Western alliance may be fractured, but is still an alliance. Countries that depend on American security guarantees, from Japan to the nations of NATO, cannot simply walk away, no matter how frustrated they are. Europe is the perfect example of this contradiction, needing America for defense while increasingly needing China for trade and technology. China has its own problems, too. The property crisis has not been resolved. Consumer spending remains soft. Youth unemployment continues to concern policymakers. Deflationary pressures are dampening growth in key sectors. This is not a country running on all cylinders. But here is the thing. Geopolitics is not about perfection. It is about positioning. And right now, Xi Jinping is positioned better than he has been in years. While Washington alienates its allies, Beijing welcomes them. While America raises walls, China opens doors, at least strategically. The 5 countries whose leaders visited Beijing in January alone, Ireland, South Korea, Canada, Finland, and the UK, have a combined GDP of $8.71 trillion. Add France, Uruguay, and the EU and India trade deals to the mix, and you are looking at a fundamental reshuffling of economic relationships that will take years, possibly decades, to fully play out. And that might be the most important takeaway of all. Even if Trump loses the next election, even if a future administration reverses course, the deals being signed right now, the relationships being built, the trade routes being diversified, those do not just disappear. Every handshake in Beijing, every treaty signed, every tariff adjusted creates a new reality on the ground. And in that new reality, China matters more and America's word matters a little less. Former British Member of Parliament Mark Logan, who spent years working in China, said something that I think captures this entire moment. He said that in Western societies, many of China's positive cultural and social characteristics have yet to be fully recognized. Whether you agree with that assessment or not, the leaders of some of the world's most important democracies clearly do. And their feet, quite literally, are doing the talking. So here's my question for you. Is this a temporary reaction to Trump's trade chaos, something that will correct itself once the political winds shift? Or are we watching the early stages of a permanent realignment, one where China plays a much bigger role in global affairs than the West ever intended to allow? Let me know what you think in the comments. I read every single one of them, and conversations like this are what make this channel special. If you got value out of this video, please hit that like button. It helps the algorithm push this content to more people who care about understanding the world. Subscribe if you have not yet, and turn on that notification bell so you are always in the loop when we drop a new breakdown. The geopolitical landscape is shifting fast, and I promise you, We are going to be right here covering every twist and turn. See you in the next one. Stay sharp.